One of the points that Matt Walsh tries to make in his History of Slavery video is that things weren't very good for whites as well. And I don't mean all over the world. He spends a great deal of time trying to explain to you how whites were also slaves, and no one that I know has ever denied that, not in any academic circles that I've been in. It is well acknowledged and understood that whites in many areas were also, in fact, enslaved. But again, as I explained in my last video, Matt Walsh and others like him, like PragerU and other right-wing conservative organizations, try and use the existence of slavery in other parts of the world to excuse the slavery that was committed here in the United States, the system of African slavery in the antebellum South and in the early Republic period of the United States. And he brings up, towards the end of his video, where he spends 90% of the video talking about slavery all around the world and doesn't focus on slavery in the United States at all, he brings up how white indentured servants were also treated very badly in the early American experience. And that is absolutely true. White indentured servants did have a very hellacious time, as did most workers during that time period, going all the way up and through the Industrial Revolution. Your average worker didn't have a very jolly life. Indentured servants, of course, had a worse go of it because they were, for all intents and purposes, enslaved, but, and here's the big but, because I want to make sure this is clear. Matt Walsh's point is correct. White indentured servants did have a very bad time. But as the antebellum period, as the slavery continued all the way up through and into the antebellum period, it has to be understood, and go see my foundational video on the YouTube channel, link in the description, that the system of slavery in the United States, the system of African slavery, as it developed from the founding of the United States, colonial period, founding of the United States, early republic, and antebellum period, became entirely based on racism and white supremacy. So this idea was developing and continued to develop in the founding of the United States all the way through until the end of the Civil War and the eventual abolition of slavery. But even white indentured servants had something over their African slave counterparts that the Africans could never have: the fact that they were white. And yes, because detractors will say, not all people in the antebellum slaveholding states own slaves. That's conceded, 100%. However, I argue, and even enslavers themselves and Southerners themselves argued, that most whites in the South benefited from the system of slavery. Not only in terms of being employed in the system as overseers or as farmhands or people who had some kind of supervisory experience over enslaved Africans, but also simply from the fact they were white. And this is something that Matt Walsh's video fails to understand and fails to recognize. That even white indentured servants, while their life may have been absolutely miserable, in the end, they were still white. And at the end of their indentured servitude, they would be part of that ruling race, that ruling ethnicity, that ruling class that would always put them above any of the enslaved. And I want to make this point to you. This was talked about in the antebellum period. I'm going to quote from Thomas R.R. Cobb's An Inquiry into the Law of Negro Slavery in the United States. This was written in the 1850s. Thomas R.R. Cobb was known as the James Madison of the Confederacy because he was instrumental in drafting the Constitution of the Confederate States of America. And this book is a compilation of court cases of state laws dealing with African slavery in the antebellum South. And it was used by attorneys during the antebellum period who were working in the field of law dealing with enslaved individuals. The Alabama Supreme Court even cites from this book, so it is a reputable book. And he says that politically, slavery is a conservative institution. The mass of laborers not being recognized among citizens, meaning blacks, every citizen, meaning whites, feels he belongs to an elevated class. It matters not that he is no slaveholder. Pay attention now. It matters not that he is no slaveholder. He is not of the inferior race. He is a freeborn citizen. He engages in no menial occupation. The poorest meets the richest as an equal, sits at his table with him, salutes him as a neighbor, meets him in every public assembly, and stands on the same social platform. Hence, there is no war of classes. There is truthfully Republican equality in the ruling class. So you have to understand that everyone in the antebellum South, in the slaveocracy, believed and understood that all whites, even an indentured servant, still stood above any black person, anyone of African descent in the antebellum South, and that the system itself benefited every white because they were part of the superior race. So he even goes on, Thomas R. Cobb even goes on to the point, and this is where no matter how indentured an indentured servant may have been, they were never going to be a slave. No whites could be slaves. And if you went and watched what I call my foundation video, so you understand where this all came from, the idea that the American system of African slavery was based on white supremacy and racism with the Somerset v. Stewart decision, and this idea, no white person could be a slave because according to Thomas Cobb and many other jurists and racial scientists like him, now he was a jurist, he wasn't a racial scientist, but he used racial science, they believed that it was only natural for one race to be enslaved by another if it bettered the condition of that race. So since people of African descent were an inferior race, that they benefited from slavery. They were made more civilized. They were designed to be in that system. Therefore, it bettered them. The same way that you can domesticate some animals because it conforms to their nature. It works with their nature. You could domesticate a cow. You can domesticate a horse. But you can't domesticate a tiger. So if you try to domesticate a tiger, if you try to domesticate a lion, this is what he talks about, it doesn't work because that goes against their fundamental nature. So therefore, it doesn't conform to the rules of nature. So whites could not enslave other whites because what would a white benefit from enslavement to another white? It doesn't better their condition. It doesn't better their knowledge. It doesn't better anything about them because two classes of equal race, and I'll put on the screen where Thomas Cobb talks about this, cannot enslave each other because that goes against the rules of nature because there's nothing to be gained. But a superior race can enslave an inferior race because that betters the inferior race. So white people, based on the understanding of the law of nature by these jurists and the racial scientists that help support them, could never happen. You could not have whites enslave other whites. The only way a white could be enslaved was if there was a superior race to whites, and enslavement to that race bettered the condition of the white man. That was what they believed. In fact, it was even it was even noted in antebellum courts that whites could not be slaves except by express statute. And that didn't happen very often. There's only one example, I believe in Maryland, where there was a law that said if a white woman married a black man or married a slave and had children with him, then she, along with those children, would become in a state of slavery. So she would then technically be allowed to be a slave. But that was quickly repealed, and this happened in the 1600s, so before even the founding of the United States. So that's the only example in the entirety of my studies that I found where there was any positive law allowing for any white person to be enslaved. Because other than that, the courts were clear that white people could not be slaves. So Matt Walsh's point, and why I'm bringing this up and trying to show this to you, Matt Walsh's point in saying that indentured servants were white and they had it just as bad as slaves, they may have had it pretty bad. They may have had it, as bad as slaves in situations during their work and during the contract of their indentured servitude. But in the end, they were still white. And the jurists and the courts and society and the upper class and the middle class and the lower class of slaveholding society always acknowledge them as being superior to anyone of African descent because of that fact, because they were white. So all of this that Matt Walsh tried to do with the indentured servitude thing doesn't take away from the point that the system was still based It was still founded in racism and white supremacy. So remember to like, subscribe, share the video, and I will see you for the next one.